welcome everyone to African Philosophy Conversations. I'm really glad to be talking with Dr. Louise de Toit today, who is at Stellenbosch University, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Her main areas of work have ranged around a wide range of themes in feminist philosophy and also in the phenomenological and hermeneutical traditions in philosophy as well. In particular, she has been interested in questions around sexual violence and specifically around rape as well. And so thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Janz. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so I'd like to start with just a little bit of background on how people get into philosophy in general and how they start working in African philosophy in particular. So can you tell us a little bit about your path to that?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to say that it was not at all an obvious choice for me to do philosophy, but I think that's a story many women my age can tell, that we had no female lecturers, and so it didn't even cross my mind that a woman could be a philosopher. And so I always took philosophy as an extra subject just because it fascinated me, and I realized there was a philosopher in me. But my main interest was literature, and I thought I was going to become an English lit teacher. So even into my fourth year, I took philosophy and literature together because I thought that they spoke very much to one another. And I think that's also why I was attracted more to the hermeneutical and the phenomenological traditions in philosophy more than the analytic tradition. And in my final year, a lecturer called me into his office and he asked me if I'd ever considered becoming a philosopher. And I said, what? No. I was going to become an English teacher. So he encouraged me, that sowed the seed, and I took the risk of paying back the education bursary and starting with a master's in philosophy, which is a real gamble in life. And it paid off. Fortunately, I got a position, but I was one of the first women in philosophy in the country. Mm-hmm. The first professor of philosophy at Stellenbosch, the first female HOD, so there's a lot of firsts. And yeah.
Well, and congratulations on those being first, but won't it be a great time when you're like the 30th or like the 100th or something like that? I mean, when it's not something to be remarked on, but it's just part of normal life.
Yeah, and the way that women would have transformed this discipline also by now, that's the thing that makes me sad, is not just that I didn't have any role models, but also what kind of philosophy would we have been taught if it was more inclusive subject from the start. So yeah, the questions lie close to my heart, and I really try to also mentor younger female students to come into the discipline and make it their own and be a little bit irreverent about making philosophy their own,
Yeah, when I've taught in South Africa, I've tried to, encourage students the way you were encouraged as well, especially women. And also Black students, and sometimes I get back the response of, well, that sounds great, but I have to go off and do this thing which is going to, result in a very immediate job or a very immediate, something that I can contribute back to my family or my community or something like that. And I totally understand that imperative in people's lives, but it is a little bit sad that, we lose some good people from philosophy because of those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the material needs are pressing in South Africa, I suppose everywhere in the world these days. So students do go for the more immediate career options. It is always a gamble to go into philosophy. I was extremely lucky. My dad was a university professor, so I could study, basically keep on studying.
Right.
So there were options for me to take the gamble, but for many other people, that is not really an option.
And now you have written on various themes in African philosophy as well. You've recently edited a book with Jonathan Chimiconum on the epistemic marginalization of women in African philosophy. So how did you find your way to thinking about African philosophy in particular, as opposed to just the broader swaths of philosophy?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was studying undergrad, because I was doing English literature and coming across, doing a lot of African literature, I started to ask, but where's the African philosophy? And my first professor that I put the question to, that was in the early 1990s in Stellenbosch, she said to me, oh, it's not really something that really exists. You can go and look in the library. There are about 5 books on the topic, and sort of it was dismissed like that. So that's a long, of course, a long battle and a long history. The first times I heard papers on African philosophy, I didn't find them inspiring at all, because they were mostly papers by white men dressed in African clothes. They would do things like, and they would.
Yeah, I remember those days.
What?
I remember those days, yes.
They would talk about anthropology, really, what Tutonji later on called ethnophilosophy, and it came across to me as extremely static, not interesting, not a living kind of philosophy that speaks to contemporary issues. So it took me a number of years to become interested, and it happened when I was asked to teach a course on African philosophy at the University of Johannesburg early in the 2000s. It was a 3rd-year module, so senior students. And by that time, the university was quite diverse already, and I was challenged to teach African philosophy to African students. And I got hold of Sarah Kweberand's book, the first one, Hermeneutics of African Philosophy. And I really enjoyed that. That really gave me a way in, because he draws on the European continental tradition that I knew well. And it made so much sense, because it presented African philosophy as something that you do as a practice, and that I could also do, that I wasn't per definition excluded from, because I didn't grow up in an African cultural environment. So that was my way in. And I was surprised to find out that, it wasn't as if the African students themselves knew more about what we call African philosophy than the white students, or even the students from anywhere else. So I understood it as something that I could sell as a kind of activity in which we could all become involved from a hermeneutical sort of stance, invite everybody to become involved. But what I also immediately saw was greater participation from the African students in the discussions in class, which I thought was very interesting for me.
Yeah, I mean, tonight's Sarah Kweberand's first book, I think, was, that's a really nice entry point, and I'm glad you found that, and I'm glad the students enjoyed it as well. He's using a particular kind of Gadamerian form of hermeneutics in a way, really leans into questions of prejudice and positionality and tradition, and he has this kind of Marxist sort of undertone to it as well, because it's very much kind of anti-colonial sort of thing as well. So I think it really I think it's a really nice introduction to African philosophy as it exists now, as opposed to some kind of abstract question. And
also as opposed to some native knowledge that you're either initiated into or not. And I also found that almost materialist undertone, where you speak from within a concrete situation, and that has helped me a lot in my work to think about how does one speak from somewhere? How do you really take up your positionality and your situatedness to do something interesting with it?
Yeah. Well, I certainly resonate with that kind of question as well, given, my interest in place. But what I'm interested in talking with you about is really, something that you've worked on quite a lot, which is questions around gender, particularly questions around gendered violence and specifically rape. And, what I find interesting about your work is that somebody who starts thinking about these questions might think, well, that's a problem of policing, or that's a problem of public policy, or that's a problem that maybe sociologists ought to be looking at, or maybe in education, or we can think of a number of areas that where people might think that naturally comes, and yet you're a philosopher and you're working on that. So can you tell me what's the philosophical path into thinking about these things rather than, like I say, the public policy path or something like that?
Thanks for that question. I really appreciate that question, because again, I didn't have much of a role model or an example when I started out. I was just so shocked. This was in the late 1990s, by the levels and degrees of viciousness in sexual violence in the country after the transition. So I was naive enough to think that the violence would stop with the transition. And I thought, well, philosophy is a tool for helping us to make sense of things. And if philosophy if it can live up to its promise, it must be able to help us with this. So this was my very naive starting point, because I was completely stumped by what I read about what was happening in terms of sexual violence in the country. And I think people say it was always there, but it came to the front much more in the first decade or so of the new dispensation. It got a lot of attention. There was almost a politicization of sexual violence as never before. And of course, then coupled with race and the new government and the AIDS epidemic at the time. So I think so it's not just you, more people are interested or surprised that one can tackle this in a philosophical way, that there's merit in that. But I think I'm just basically very curious about the meaning making that's going on there. What does it mean? First of all, my question was, what does it mean to the victim? What does this damage consist in? Because you can be raped and you can maybe not be physically damaged by it. So what is it? What is the harm precisely? And for that, I used quite a bit of phenomenology, feminist phenomenologists, to try and flesh out and spell out what the damage really consists in. And I also became obviously interested in what is the motivation, what does the perpetrator get out of it, and how do meanings or how do worlds shift through the act of sexual attack. So I gave a kind of an ontological edge to it. I started to say, well, violence has the capacity to not only destroy worlds, but also produce worlds, and to do both at the same time. So it became a kind of almost a dialectic of ontologies in the experience of sexual violence and attack. So that's my way into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating. And I've thought about questions around torture, maybe in parallel fashion. I've tried to make the case that torture is, in a certain sense, a kind of violation of place. In other words, a disemplacement of somebody in such a manner that they are unable to reinscribe themselves in place. They're unable to find their place. And if you look at the, like Jean Amery and Primo Levi and, some of these writers about the Holocaust, quite often they come back to place imagery and they're unable to, reinscribe it. And sometimes it's even in kind of somatic and very bodily forms of repetitive body motion and walking and, all of these sorts of things. And it very much feels like the very ability to connect meaning to place has been undermined and destroyed in that act. So I'm interested, I mean, you put another layer on that with sexual violence, I think, which is, the loss of meaning, but also the reinscription of meaning as well. And I think that's a really interesting kind of angle on this too.
Yeah. But I like your image of displacement. That really rings true for me. I based my first analyses mostly on first-person accounts of survivors, and that sense of not feeling home anywhere anymore. You in your mother's house, in your bed where you grew up as a child, and still feel unsafe. So your first home, your body itself, is no longer a safe place. And then that disconnectedness with previously familiar spaces, that you simply lose a very basic bodily trust, trust in your body's capacity to gauge the world, to read the world, and to notice when it becomes dangerous. Yeah. Because I think in every such an extreme attack, there's a sense of where did I misjudge this?
Yeah, sure.
Where did I land here? And Amari, in that description of the officer hitting him through the face, he actually says, it's such a physical imposition of this man onto me, it is a rape.
Yeah, sure, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. We get the moving back and forth between the images of sexual violence and genocidal violence and ethnic violence. And that's a really interesting, because we don't want to conflate all of those to being just the same thing, but at the same time, there are conversations and echoes, if you wish. So, I mean, what you've been talking about is a kind of very, as you say, phenomenological, experience of this, but you've also written about larger social structures. You've written about the Constitution, you've written about South African law, and things of this nature in connection with sexual violence. And so how do you see that side of it? That, seems like quite a distance from the felt reality of sexual violence. What part does that play?
So, sorry, I was thinking about something else you'd said, and I wanted to come back to it.
Well, we can go back to that too. It's, these conversations have little rabbit trails, and I'm perfectly fine with that. So.
Okay, let me just quickly say about the analogy with torture, for instance. I've also used that, and I've used the work of Elaine Scarry.
Oh yeah, sure.
To actually come to a lot of my phenomenological fleshing out of rape. I from Scarry's vocabulary as she uses it in terms of torture.
Yeah.
But it's interesting then how when one connects rape to something like torture, it suddenly becomes legible to a lot of people who couldn't see the damage before.
Right.
And this was actually one of the strategies followed by the International Criminal Court, also in their attempt to give war rape more of a status comparative to what rape has under domestic law, and it was under pressure from feminist lobby groups. So then they would explicitly use the analogy with torture to say, once it's been proven that a person has been raped, you don't have to prove also all the damages that go with it. It is assumed it is as bad as torture.
Yes.
But it still sort of piggybacks on all the things that it is analogized to, So that's also interesting. So rape is like torture, therefore it is bad, or at least war rape is like torture, therefore it is bad, or it is genocidal in its intent and motives, therefore it is particularly horrible. But of course, there are from a feminist perspective also problems with that. I just wanted to mention.
Well, and that's fascinating, isn't it? That I mean, I think that's a great thing to use that kind of leverage for people to understand. But at the same time, I mean, somebody might think about genocide as being against an entire ethnic group or an entire people or something like that, and it's manifest on individual bodies. But you know, somebody, and this is maybe the kind of inherent sexism in how we think of these things differently. You know, when it comes to rape, it's always about individuals. In other words, it's not about women in general. It's about, you know, this one woman in particular, and therefore it's a very individualized pain, not something that can be dealt with at the level of, you know, human rights, you know, or these large scale liberal concepts or something like that. And that does feel like a kind of sexist dismissal of that kind of pain, because since it doesn't feel like it's, you know, against an entire ethnic group, then it's not as important, or it's not as serious or something like that.
Yeah. I think that brings us straight back to the question that I interrupted.
Excellent. See, the rabbit trails, they get places. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you asked about the broader things like the Constitution, and rape law and so on. Also the international criminal law. I've written a bit on that, and how war in rape is looked at, but rape in war is looked at. But I think there is a strong tendency to privatize and individualize sexual violence in particular, to keep it out of our vocabulary of politics and international relations and so on. Of course, feminists are fighting back, but there's still a tendency to see politics as a masculine affair, and to see things that mostly or mainly touch women as, per definition, private and sexual, and maybe pathological as well.
Right.
So that's what I noticed also in the different discourses on sexual violence in the country, especially in the early days when the first stats started to come out about the extent of rape in South Africa under democracy, under the new dispensation and all of that.
And those stats are shocking, aren't they? I mean, I mean, I don't know what the recent ones are, but when I saw the earlier ones, it was pretty jaw-dropping how much sexual violence there was.
Yeah, and it's still the same. And people that I've spoken to, people who've done the historical research, tell me it was not different before. It was as bad under apartheid. It has a very long colonial history, from being sort of rooted in slavery in the Cape, and all the cultures are extremely patriarchal. All the South African ethnic groups, I would say, have very strong patriarchal histories. So it's more a question of becoming aware, and suddenly under democratic pressure having to monitor and account for these numbers, which was not the case under the earlier regimes. But coupled with that, I think there's been a consistent tendency in South Africa's history to not look at sexual relations as part of the political sphere. So it was a fight amongst men. The reconciliation process was an embrace of the brothers in the mother's kitchen, I always say. You know, so the black and the white brother found one another, but they were hosted by the mother, but she was excluded from, you know, so she provided the material backdrop for their embrace, but she was not herself let into the reconciliation process. So the reconciliation process itself, I think, reinforced politics as a male affair and the social contract as a masculine contract, and highlighted race. And we still have that problem that all questions around sex and sexuality and sexual violence are translated into, in a very deliberate and pernicious way, are short-circuited through racial discourses. So, you know, if a white woman raises the issue of sexual violence, she's implicitly herself a racist, you know, even though she might not make the assumption that the rapist is black or whatever, it's read into the discourse, and it's short-circuited in that way. So, and when an African woman says that she's un-African, you know, she's co-opted by the West and so on. So you get all these defense mechanisms to try and ensure that the gendered distribution of power doesn't become part of the mainstream political agenda.
Well, in the, in the US, we often talk about intersectionality, the ways in which different forms of marginalization produce an experience. I almost think of it the way waves work in the ocean, where you have crests of waves at the meeting of two other waves, something that would not be, obvious or possible from any one of them alone. Before that, we had the notion of the subaltern, Gayatri Spivak. Is there any way of that of in South Africa that one could think about sexual violence is not reducible to discussion about race, or is it simply that's such a powerful move that it's really hard to resist?
I think there's almost a repeat of the colonial compact, that we see now in the post-colony. So if the colonial compact expected of African men to betray African women, the post-colonial is in a sense requiring that again. I'm not sure if I put this very well, but I think it's important to read this through the lens of coloniality and to ask what was made of the African woman through the colonial project. She was turned into the abject, and she was turned into less than human. And it could only happen with the complicity of the men who had a different status under the colonial regime. And I'm afraid, I think that mentality to see, so Pumla Deneo is a South African scholar who writes a lot about sexual violence in the country. And she says, basically, under colonization, the Black woman, the indigenous woman become unrapeable in the sense of beyond the pale of rape law, beyond the interest or concern of the policing of rape. So only white women were rapeable.
Right.
And Black women were beyond that, always already damaged, or always, not having a dignity to lose even.
Yeah.
So these are really harsh forms of abjection. And her point is that these things have become institutionalized. It's in the service, it's in the correctional services, it's in the health services, that the Black woman's body in particular is seen as already abject.
Right.
And so the instruments of the state do not kick in the same way as when it is a white or a white woman.
Well, and I think it was Jacob Zuma who used the kind of traditionalist defense of, it's not rape because, it's part of, African tradition. And there was a lot of discussion around that, but it seems to feed right into the, description you just gave of the abjection of the, Black female body and the white female body in South Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there are always interest groups that then fall for that kind of rhetoric, that are happy to hear that kind of rhetoric. But of course, it reinforces a very specific way of looking at African culture. So he used it to save himself, but he presented African culture in the way that the white judge also thought of it.
Yeah, right.
The white and the Black masculinities could meet one another there, and again, it led to the sacrifice of the Black woman.
I think this is such a fascinating place, not only for questions around the experience of women in South Africa, but about how you think about African philosophy as well, right? Because we might think about African philosophy as the sort of thing, that colonialism, run roughshod over, and we should be getting back to some sort of, indigenous notion of Africanity, and all fine and good. But, if that indigenous notion comes down to violence against women as well, what resources do you have at your disposal to say, no, wait a minute, there's nothing sacrosanct about, a philosophical position which either advocates or allows violence against women. I mean,
No, exactly. But also, and here the critical hermeneutical me is always around, and I think the way in which African tradition is often portrayed is simply too simplistic and static, and not complex and fluid enough. There are so many language groups on the continent. There were so many different cultural traditions. There were matriarchies, there were patriarchies, there were female chiefs who were simply not acknowledged. They were ignored by the British government when they colonized those areas. And so the female chiefs got forgotten and kicked out. And there were goddesses on the continent, so and on some readings, I don't know if you're familiar with Oyewumi's work,
sure, yeah.
and Amadiume. They make the point that pre-colonial, at least in Yoruba culture or some very specific culture, if you look at the language, for instance, and you go back to oral tradition, that there was much more fluidity and that power was not strictly gendered. So there are resources definitely on the continent for at least complicating that thing that we think we should be going back to. And then the collusion between the colonial powers and the men destroyed many of those older traditions and made them almost unrecognizable. And then, of course, also the influence of Christianity, which was very strongly patriarchal and sort of just erased the forms of power that women traditionally had. And in many cases, it was a divide and rule on a gendered basis. So you privilege the men in the same gesture that you demote the women's status.
Well, and I think that fluidity, which you talk about, Oyerumi talking about, also has implications for LGBT questions as well in Africa, right? I mean, if there's fluidity, there's not binary opposition of it was male and female and ever since the beginning of time it was ever thus. It was and there's so many examples of that fluidity in performative ways in various cultures in Africa that I think one of the violences of colonialism was both the complicity of men in colonialism and also the flattening out of all the kinds of gender performance that had existed. So
completely on. And also I think what we miss a lot of this because we think of colonialism as a form of extreme racism.
Right.
I think we forget that race was intertwined with sex right from the start. There was a way in which race was, persons were racialized on the basis of their being ostensibly closer to nature, more animalistic, not energized by forces that they do not control.
Right.
So lack of self-control. These are overly sexualized creatures.
Right.
That was a trope created by European modernity to justify things that were completely unjustifiable within its own frame of thinking.
Right.
And so race for me was this kind of heuristic that solved the problem of colonization. And so now when someone like Robert Mugabe, okay, no longer, but when he used to say homosexuality is un-African, I think what he is fleeing away from is that abject figure that has been created of the African by the West. And a Christian mentality which sees the homosexual as overly sexed, as sexually perverse, and that is so closely intertwined with racism that you cannot possibly endure that image of yourself.
Yeah.
Because it is such a such a degraded image. It's at the heart of racism, I would say. So that's how I make sense of this vehemently homophobic and patriarchal discourse that come out of Africa. Of course, fed by American TV.
Absolutely, and you see it in Uganda, and you see it other places. I mean, when I lived in Kenya, you know, and when I was there, it was in Western Kenya, so near the border of Uganda, and you know, and I would talk to people, you know, about if they knew any gay people, you know, or what they thought of homosexuality, and the responses were really interesting. I mean, you know, if you know anything about Kenya, it's, you know, it's both Christian and Muslim, and they're, you know, diverse. I mean, as with practically every country in Africa, very diverse ethnically, linguistically, and all of that. And the answers I would get was, well, we don't have any gay people here, but on the coast, there's lots of gay people. You know, so it was like that internal, you know, the other is.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was fascinating. Well, okay, so I mean, you've sketched out a you know, a dire situation which has, you know, statistics that are horrible, and it's embedded within a kind of patriarchal and you know, political and juridical sort of system. What does one do? I mean, how do you resist? Are there ways of transforming that, short of, I mean, you know, I think everyone hoped that the South African Constitution, which is, you know, often regarded as a very progressive constitution, you know, maybe that would fix things. Clearly that's not been the case. You know, what can women do? What can women of color do? What can you know, what can anyone do in the face of this accepted reality?
Oh, that's an enormous question. As you speak and as your sentence goes on and on, I'm thinking this that way.
Sorry about that.
What can I possibly say? But I visited Colombia in 2019, and I was so struck by the strong network of rape victims plus professional women that was very visible and very vocal. Made themselves heard and seen. You know, they would come forward and dance as a group of victims on the stage. So they were fighting for reparations after the peace negotiations. And that was for me really impressive, because in South Africa, I had not really seen survivors of rape daring to speak out yet. You know, it's almost as if you invite a second rape. So if you see rape as a kind of political punishment, then you are precisely calling rape upon your head if you were to take a public stand against it. So I'm not sure what's the difference between their situation and ours, but there's still a lot of shame and stigma around it. So people struggle to become politically activist around this. The police, we know now, are extremely bad when it comes to policing of sexual crimes, especially in poorer and Black communities. You know, there's even, I think, like in the US, it's one of the big complaints against the police is that they themselves are sexually violent. So the sexism and the misogyny is embedded in our institutions. And yes, we have a very progressive constitution, but it's not worth anything unless people fight for it on the ground and in practical contexts. So I thought stupid ways, but maybe ways that can help. The one is to pick up the pieces afterwards, and that is to make sure that there's a proper clinic that can receive women in every single township and neighborhood, you know, a refuge, but also where they can lay a complaint, but in a safe space, because sometimes you have to complain in front of the person who raped you, or, you know, it's just horrendous.
Right.
And I've also thought about training magistrates better. So the lower courts are now handling rape cases, even though they're not supposed to. There are just too many to be handled by the proper level of court, and those people are not properly trained. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and prejudice that go into rape trials typically. Yeah, and then I think political activism, and I think if women were to find a way to actually avenge themselves, you know, to hit back, to take political action, and to show that we will not take it lying down. So I've been fantasizing about women getting violent and forming hit squads. You know?
Well, and now you've also done some work on Gandhi and Satyagraha and things like that. So is there an avenue of response through that, do you think, through the kind of a nonviolent resistance that Gandhi represented, or do you think that that's just really not feasible with something like this?
No, I think there is. But the one thing I want to say about Gandhi and Satyagraha is that for him, it was extremely important to say that you cannot practice, he calls it, you cannot offer Satyagraha from a position of weakness or passivity, you know. So what that tells me is you must be willing and able to fight back. Actually, he says it's better to fight back than to be acquiescent. You know, so a violent response is 100% better than passivity and lying down. But a non-violent approach is 100% better than a violent response. And he thinks it takes more courage to fight non-violently than to fight violently. But then, unfortunately, he calls it, therefore it's a manly pursuit, you know. So so he sort of genders the virtues. He says women should be able to be good with Satyagraha because they're so used to being bullied and violated, and you know, they're so patient.
Turning weakness to strength, I guess. Yeah, I mean, you know, as you talk, I keep thinking of. Sorry, I think I just lost the.
Yeah, I just lost your sound.
Okay, I think I'm back. You know, I keep thinking of a kind of Frantz Fanon sort of response, who's also thinking in terms of what the place of violence is in resistance to colonialism. And, you know, his is a very psychological sort of response. In other words, it's not just about, you know, overthrowing state structures. It's about a kind of, you know, catharsis that is meant to deal with the psychological damage that was done by colonialism.
Yeah.
So is there a sense of, you know, when you talk about, you know, hitting back, is there also a sense of recapturing a kind of psychological wholeness in doing so, or you know, what do you think the place of pushing back is, other than just changing a culture, changing laws, changing whatever?
You know, some feminists have written about this. I'm thinking of Anne Cahill, who wrote about self-defense, not really as an individualistic tool or weapon against being individually attacked, but as a way to transform the female body into an instrument of power rather than just an object for violence. It becomes a subject who can be violent. And she says it will even show in your body comportment as you walk the street at night that you can defend yourself and that you're willing to defend yourself. And that changes your perception as well.
Right.
So there's an induced passivity in women if they are told from childhood on that their bodies are in danger. They are danger and in danger because they bring these forces upon themselves if they are not careful. But to change that, Cahill speaks of a pre-victimhood, which you, in a sense, exhibit in the way you carry yourself, you know, and if you can transform that into, and that's also how I want to think about Gandhi and Fanon. For me, the non-violent person lies on the other side of violence. In other words, you are willing and able to be violent, and then you suspend that capacity. That's how I see Gandhi's understanding of it. And then it becomes a virtue. It's not a virtue if you cannot and you won't, be violent, but only if you suspend that capacity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that. Yeah. So
yeah,
I'm interested.
So that then also would go for women. If we remain in a place of victimhood, it does nothing for our sense of self and our dignity. And that's the Fananian point, is that you restore your humanity. Now he puts it very harshly, you shoot the colonizer, you liberate yourself.
Right.
It's also somehow the only way to gain that dignity. But I would not go as far as that, but I would say maybe we have to rethink the relationship between women and violence. Think what it means for women to accede to the position of political violence first, before we ask them to suspend that capacity for violence.
Right.
Because I think at the moment there's an unfair symbolic division of labor, and women are actually penalized just for accessing violence,
right,
in a way that men are not. And it's also delegitimized as pathological rather than political.
Mm-hmm.
And here I'm thinking of someone like Winnie Mandela, for instance, who was really a model freedom fighter, but she was made to pay for that in a gendered way.
Right.
And then talk about women also participating in nonviolent action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm interested in how all of this connects to what we might think of as the, main conversations within African philosophy. I mean, you know very well that in philosophy in general, the representation of women has been very poor. And that's not only true in South Africa, that's certainly true in the US, and it's true in, pretty much everywhere. The representation of women in African philosophy has probably been even worse, over the years. And, perhaps as a result, we get, discussions of concepts within African philosophy that seem quite, degendered. I mean, when personhood comes up, it's gendered personhood doesn't generally come up as well. Or at least it's not part of the conversation from the beginning. It's maybe something, at best down the line. Yeah. And so do you think that there are any resources within African philosophy that might, either help us understand what's going on with all of this, or contribute to some sort of solutions? Or do you think this is something that African philosophy needs to be brought along on, and it's really something it hasn't really reflected on and needs to do better with?
Firstly, maybe let me just comment and say, I thought at first when I started out in Western philosophy that the absence of women there is a South African thing.
Yeah.
And, it's better in the progressive liberal West. And I was shocked to see how masculine and male philosophy was everywhere else, and how especially women who did feminist philosophy were told they were not real philosophers.
Right.
And couldn't become full professors and so on. So there was even more of a bias against an explicitly gendered perspective on the discipline in the hubs, I would say, in Europe and North America than in South Africa, which is in a sense a more marginal place. Mm-hmm. So incidentally, my department now has 5 women and 3 men. Wow. Cool. Yeah. And at some point, I think we struck a world record when a third of the department was pregnant.
Wow. Well, and to the credit of your department, I'm glad that that is a very unusual demographic, I have to say.
It is unusual, yeah. But the problem is we're not diverse in terms of race.
Right.
It's But in any case, that's a whole story for another day. But so in African philosophy, I think there's a kind of just a double alienation for African women from the discipline. And philosophy is a difficult discipline if you do it well, if you love it and you go into it deeply. I think young people immediately realize it's going to change them forever. It is an extremely personal journey. It questions all your presumptions and preconceptions. And if you have to do that journey in a hostile place, you leave. You know? So I think many people who have a philosophical personality or inclination, but come into the discipline in a very combative, very manly, very harshly argumentative place where you score points against one another and there's a winner and a loser. You know, if that is the way philosophy is taught, very few people who are not white males would love it there. Right. And would say, okay, this is the place where I want to explore these things for myself.
Right.
And I think therefore we lose people who are less confident in public debating or whatever to literature and all kinds of other subjects. Mm-hmm. And historically, we know that African women have expressed themselves in fiction writing very strongly. So that was also initially dominated by men, overwhelmingly so. And of course, there's a whole, you know, it's in a sense also a creation of colonization. We so often think phenomena in Africa are indigenous phenomena. They come sort of out of the culture internally created, but the backlog or the what is the English word for this? Let's say the absence of African women in philosophy and academia more generally, it's a colonial creation. Right. You know, the way the missions focused on teaching only the boys to read and write, and there's a whole history to this, why the women are not so well represented. And I think philosophy is still so unself-aware. It still has so many trappings and blind spots, ironically, about how parochial it so often is. So sometimes I think if you ask an African woman to do philosophy the way Sarah Queberan proposes we do it, that is from a concrete lived experience, thinking that through systematically and making sense of it, that they almost have to reinvent philosophy to be able to do that. You know, it's almost a mortal combat between how philosophy is currently in the mainstream packaged and what African women live through. Yeah. It's almost set up to be opposite worlds. Intertwined but opposite worlds, coming from completely different places.
Well, I sometimes use a distinction between what I call a mode of thought and a space of thought. And a mode of thought is a what I think of as a centripetal move. In other words, often I see African philosophy in a certain sense as being obsessed with the question of what is African philosophy, and therefore what is philosophy in Africa. And so many resources are you know, devoted to answering that kind of question, which means that you end up getting something that, you know, looks like a very kind of unified project, whereas a space of thought is exactly the opposite. It moves out rather than in, and it's based on a different kind of question, a question that can have multiple answers, maybe mutually exclusive answers, but nevertheless, they're still addressing a similar question. And so that becomes a very rich area then. You know, it's not the project of let's answer this one question in order to justify ourselves, but let's explore this space based on a question, hopefully based in some phenomenological reality.
So, I like that. Yeah, I like the way that you describe that. Yeah, so philosophy really has to it has such a task in Africa because it's been so complicit, you know, and it's been sold as the epitome of intellectual endeavor and just the brightest minds. Yeah, so I almost want to say African women have to be included for the sake of philosophy, almost even more than for their sake, you know. But obviously, everybody finds if you can develop your own philosophical voice, it's a very large part of becoming a flourishing human being. I would say. So it is good for people to have that skill, but I think at the moment what goes under the banner of African philosophy, and it's very contentious, as you know, there are as many definitions as there are philosophers almost. I'm too scared to call myself an African philosopher, but
I don't call myself
and I do philosophy. I don't know, but there's almost I would say a body of literature and a canon now, a established canon of African philosophy. So maybe you can say if you engage with that tradition of books and those authors who've responded to one another on these topics, you are probably busy with doing African philosophy. Never mind that you are an African philosopher. But as you say, that debate has been completely gender blind, but also because it is a place in which it's still, for me, it's so bound up with the project of decolonizing an African perspective and decolonizing the curriculums, that it's become a safe space for some people. You know, this is our thing. This is what makes us different. This is the alternative we offer to the world. To explode that by bringing in the whole gender debate feels like just too much for some of these scholars. I've actually seen that argument being made in that anthology that Jonathan and I put together, that we are barely we've barely managed to create an African philosophy, and now you want to even expect of us to invite women's voices in, you know. So that's a strange thing, and then I can see why some African scholars are then saying, oh, but this feminism thing is an imported thing and it's un-African, and we don't have to have women's voices to make, you know, we represent African philosophy sufficiently. And I think to completely deny, again, the sexual and the gender dimension of the colonial project, you cannot tackle that monster if you do not take its sexual dimension into account. That's my view. That's why I constantly say African feminism is at the heart of the decolonization project. If you can't see that, you're just gonna create something equally bad as colonialism.
Well, you know, I have another 100 or so questions I want to ask you, but I've kept you online long enough. So let me wrap this up. You know, you teach a variety of courses at Stellenbosch, and let's suppose you're teaching, you know, an intro philosophy course. How do you get students engaged in African philosophy, interested in it? Do you do it through the door of feminist philosophy, or do you do it some other way? You know, how do you go about that?
Yeah, I think I would start with contemporary scholars addressing contemporary problems. So I would definitely not take the ethno-philosophical route,
right?
Which I think is alien even for our Black students very often, because very often those ethnographies and cosmologies are quite culturally specific, you know. So it would be something out of Ghana or something out of Nigeria and then it's alien. It's just very far removed from what my students know. So yes, I like to introduce thinkers like Mbembe and African thinkers, but also novelists and playwrights and filmmakers, because I think all of those are philosophically interesting. Sure. And my first love was the African novel. But it also has to do with the way in which I teach philosophy, is that I bring in existential and phenomenological texts and so on. I do not usually start with the I must say the Caribbean or the North American Black writers, because I think that tends to move the conversation in another way, which is not unhelpful for us, but that doesn't capture Sarah Quiberon's instinct about thinking from your own horizon. Mm-hmm. Even if we look at Caribbean philosophers and so on, we still borrow theories from elsewhere. We have not had the transatlantic slave trade. We have a very different history. So I prefer authors from the region, the far south region, and people who speak to contemporary issues, but maybe in more disciplines than just philosophy, and ask what is philosophically interesting about them.
Yeah, it's, sometimes this term Africana gets used, which I have a lot of sympathy for in some ways, but it can obscure the differences, and so, for example, one way I, kind of quickly encapsulate the difference between slavery and colonialism is that in slavery, you are taken from your place, and in colonialism, your place is taken from you. And those are both brutalities, but they're different brutalities, right? And
that's an interesting way to put it.
We're not pitting one against the other. We're saying there's a phenomenological lived experience that needs to be taken seriously in those sorts of things, and they can inform each other, but in the end, they are different kinds of experiences.
Yeah. Absolutely,
yeah. So, well, Dr. du Toit, thank you so much for this conversation. It was great. We got into a lot of stuff, and I think my students and others are going to really find this valuable. So thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Janz, and I really hope this means something somewhere to somebody. Thanks.
Oh, I'm sure it will. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.